Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about Rome conquering Greece. Greece already conquered Rome. Centuries before Roman legions marched triumphantly through Corinth, Greek culture, philosophy and art had infiltrated every aspect of Roman life. From the gods they worshipped, rebranded versions of the Greek pantheon of course, to the architecture of their temples and the plays performed in their theatres, Rome was thoroughly Hellenized. So how did the student become the master? How did a nation so profoundly influenced by another turn around and subjugate its cultural mentor? It's a story of ambition, pragmatism, and a ruthless efficiency that the Greeks, for all their brilliance, simply couldn't match. This isn't just about battles and empires. It's about the clash of two fundamentally different civilizations, their strengths, their weaknesses, and the unexpected ways they shaped each other. It's about the enduring legacy of Greece and the brutal practicality of Rome. It's a story that resonates even today, reminding us that cultural influence doesn't always translate to political power, and that sometimes the most innovative ideas are no match for disciplined force. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's start with the obvious question nobody asks. Why did Rome even care about Greece? It wasn't some sudden, impulsive decision. The seeds of conflict were sown long before Roman legions set foot on Greek soil. It all boils down to a potent mix of ambition, opportunity, and a healthy dose of Roman pragmatism. In the 3rd century BCE, Rome was a rising power, rapidly expanding its influence throughout the Italian peninsula. They had just finished slugging it out with Carthage in the Punic Wars. These wars were a brutal, generation-spanning conflict that saw Hannibal Barca nearly bring Rome to its knees, but ultimately forged the Romans into a hardened, disciplined fighting force. The victory over Carthage left Rome in control of vast territories and a massive battle-tested army. The question wasn't if Rome would expand further, but where. The Eastern Mediterranean, including Greece, presented a tempting target. The once mighty Greek city-states, the powerhouses of the classical age, were shadows of their former selves. The Peloponnesian War, that decades-long internecine conflict between Athens and Sparta, had weakened them considerably. Alexander the Great's conquests had briefly united the region, but his empire fractured upon his death, leaving behind a collection of squabbling successor kingdoms, each vying for dominance. These kingdoms, ruled by Alexander's former generals, the Diadochi, were constantly at war with each other, creating a power vacuum that Rome was only too happy to fill. Think about this for a second. Rome, a relatively young republic with a knack for military organization and a hunger for expansion, looking east at a region brimming with wealth, resources, and internal strife. The stage was set for a clash of civilizations. Now here's the thing that blows my mind about this whole period. Rome didn't initially set out to conquer Greece outright. Their initial involvement was often framed as intervention, as giam, quote gias. Greek cities from tyrannical rulers or rival kingdoms. They presented themselves as liberators, champions of Greek freedom. It was a clever strategy, allowing them to gain a foothold in the region and build alliances with various Greek factions. But let's not be naive. This wasn't pure altruism. Rome was playing a long game. They understood that a fractured and unstable Greece was ripe for exploitation. By meddling in Greek affairs, they could weaken their rivals, secure valuable resources, and ultimately extend their own power and influence. And here's a detail most people miss. Roman expansion wasn't just about land and resources, it was also about prestige. Roman aristocrats, eager to prove their worth and climb the political ladder, saw military command as the quickest route to glory. Conquering new territories, defeating powerful enemies, and returning to Rome with spoils of war were all essential ingredients for a successful political career. Greece, with its rich history and cultural significance, offered a particularly attractive prize. Imagine the political capital to be gained by the land of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle. The First Macedonian War, 214 to 205 BCE, provides a perfect illustration of Rome's early involvement in Greece. Philip V of Macedon, one of the most powerful rulers in the region, allied himself with Hannibal during the Second Punic War. This alliance, though ultimately ineffective, was enough to provoke Rome into action. They didn't launch a full-scale invasion of Macedonia. Instead, they formed alliances with the Aetolian League and other Greek city-states opposed to Philip, providing them with financial and military support to keep him occupied. It was a proxy war, fought on Greek soil, with Rome pulling the strings from afar. The war ended in a stalemate, but it served its purpose. It weakened Philip, distracted him from aiding Hannibal, and gave Rome a taste of the political complexities of the Eastern Mediterranean. And about that Macedonian alliance with Carthage, it's important to note that it was largely born out of mutual resentment of Roman power. Philip, seeing Rome's growing influence in the Adriatic Sea, feared for his own kingdom's security. Hannibal, of course, was locked in a life-or-death struggle with Rome. Their alliance, though geographically challenging, was a logical response to the perceived threat posed by the Roman Republic. The Second Macedonian War, 200 to 197 BCE, saw Rome intervene more directly in Greece. Philip V, still ambitious and eager to expand his power, clashed with several Greek city-states. These cities appealed to Rome for help, and the Senate, sensing an opportunity to further weaken Philip and solidify its influence, readily agreed. This time, Rome sent a full-fledged army to Greece, led by the capable general Titus Quinctius Flamininus. Flamininus was a brilliant politician, as well as a skilled military commander. He understood that winning the hearts and minds of the Greek people was just as important as winning battles. He presented himself as a liberator, promising to restore Greek freedom and autonomy. At the Battle of Cynoscephalae in 197 BCE, Flamininus decisively defeated Philip, shattering Macedonian power and paving the way for Roman dominance in Greece. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. After the victory, Flamininus declared the quote too at the Isthmian Games in Corinth. Imagine the scene. Thousands of Greeks gathered to celebrate the games, listening in stunned silence as a Roman general announced that all Greek cities were to be free, autonomous, and exempt from taxation. It was a masterstroke of propaganda, earning Rome widespread goodwill and solidifying its image as a benevolent protector. But of course, that quote 3 came with strings attached. Rome expected gratitude, loyalty, and above all obedience. The Greek city-states were now firmly within Rome's sphere of influence, their fates inextricably linked to the whims of the Senate. The Third Macedonian War, 171 to 168 BCE, saw another Macedonian king, Perseus, attempting to restore his kingdom's former glory. This time, Rome responded with even greater force, crushing Perseus at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE. Macedonia was divided into 4 republics, effectively ending its independence, and this is where the facade of quote 4 began to crumble. The Romans, tired of the constant infighting and instability among the Greek city-states, started to exert more direct control over the region. They intervened in internal disputes, imposed their will on local governments, and gradually eroded Greek autonomy. The Achaean League, a confederation of city-states in the Peloponnese, dared to challenge Roman authority. This act of defiance led to the Achaean War in 146 BCE. The Romans, under the command of Lucius Mummius, brutally crushed the Achaean League, sacking the city of Corinth and selling its inhabitants into slavery. Think about the symbolism of this event. Corinth, one of the most important and prosperous cities in Greece, reduced to rubble by Roman legions. It was a clear message to the rest of Greece. Resistance was futile. The destruction of Corinth marked a turning point in Roman-Greek relations. The pretense of quote 5 was gone. Greece was now effectively a Roman protectorate, its cities subject to Roman law and its resources at Rome's disposal. So, by 146 BCE, Rome had effectively conquered Greece, not through a single decisive battle, but through a series of calculated interventions, strategic alliances, and ruthless displays of force. The Greek city-states, weakened by internal divisions and unable to match Rome's military might, had gradually succumbed to Roman dominance, and were only getting started. In the next chapter, we'll delve deeper into how Rome consolidated its control over Greece, the administrative structures they put in place, and the complex relationship between the conquerors and the conquered. We'll also explore how Greek culture continued to influence Rome, even as Rome imposed its political will on Greece. But that's a story for the next chapter. So, Corinth lay in ruins, 146 BCE. The Achaean League, that last gasp of organized Greek resistance, was crushed. But what happens after? You conquer a place. Victory is one thing, holding on to it is another beast entirely. You can't just declare, "We won," and expect everyone to fall in line. Ask any empire. Maintaining control is often messier and arguably harder than the initial conquest. For Rome, Greece presented a unique challenge. It wasn't like Carthage, which was utterly razed and its territory repurposed. Greece was Greece, a land brimming with history, philosophy, art, and a stubborn sense of its own importance. You couldn't simply erase that, even if you wanted to, and some Romans probably did want to. So, how did Rome transform a collection of fractious, freedom-loving city-states into a reliable, revenue-generating part of its growing empire? The answer, as it often is with the Romans, is a blend of pragmatism, brutality, and a surprising amount of, well, let's call it quote 7 first. Let's dispel any illusions about a sudden sweeping Romanization of Greece. There wasn't one. No legions of Roman architects immediately descended to replace every temple with a replica of the Forum. No wholesale imposition of Roman law overnight. The Romans were smarter than that. They understood that a heavy-handed approach would only breed resentment and rebellion. Instead, they opted for a more subtle, insidious strategy: divide and rule, with a Roman twist. The Achaean League was dissolved naturally. Its member cities, once united, however tenuously, against a common enemy, were now directly answerable to Rome. This wasn't direct rule in the sense of Roman governors flooding the peninsula, not yet anyway. Instead, Rome skillfully used existing power structures, identifying and empowering local elites who were willing to cooperate. These collaborators, often wealthy landowners or influential merchants, became Rome's proxies, ensuring order and collecting taxes in exchange for Roman favour and protection. Think of it as a sophisticated form of indirect rule, greased with promises of wealth and influence. And speaking of taxes, yes, the price of freedom. Flamininus' famous declaration at Corinth, that grand pronouncement of Greek liberty, now rang hollow in the ears of anyone trying to scrape together enough coin to pay their Roman-imposed levies. While Rome didn't immediately bleed Greece dry, the taxes were certainly noticeable, especially after decades of war and instability. These funds flowed back to Rome, fueling its expansion and enriching its coffers. It was a clever system. The Greeks were essentially paying for their own subjugation, but it wasn't just about money. Rome also understood the power of symbolism. They didn't tear down every Greek monument, but they did make sure everyone knew who was in charge. Triumphal arches were erected not necessarily in every city, but in strategically important locations, proclaiming Roman victories and the might of the Roman legions. Statues of Roman generals and statesmen were placed prominently, a constant reminder of Roman power. Think of it like this: you're living in Athens, surrounded by the glorious ruins of your ancestors, the Parthenon looming overhead. But now, nestled amongst those familiar landmarks, is a gleaming new statue of some Roman dude you've never heard of, looking stern and holding a scroll. Subliminal messaging at its finest. And what about the Greeks themselves? How did they react to this new reality? Well, reactions were varied. Some, particularly those who had benefited from Roman patronage, embraced the new order. They saw Rome as a guarantor of stability and prosperity, a welcome change from the constant infighting that had plagued Greece for centuries. Others, especially those who remembered a time before Roman interference, harboured deep resentment. They saw Rome as a foreign occupier, a brutal conqueror who had stolen their freedom and imposed its will upon them. This resentment, however, was often muted. Open rebellion was risky, and the fate of Corinth served as a stark warning to anyone contemplating resistance. Instead, resistance took more subtle forms: passive non-compliance, grumbling in taverns, and the preservation of Greek culture and traditions in the face of Roman influence. This cultural aspect is crucial to understanding the long-term relationship between Rome and Greece. While Rome politically dominated Greece, Greece culturally dominated Rome. It's a fascinating paradox, think about it. Roman elites flocked to Greece to study philosophy, rhetoric, and the arts. They hired Greek tutors to educate their children. They filled their villas with Greek sculptures and pottery. They even adopted Greek architectural styles. Roman literature was heavily influenced by Greek models. Virgil's Aeneid, for example, is essentially a Roman retelling of the Iliad and the Odyssey. In essence, Rome conquered Greece militarily, but Greece conquered Rome culturally. It's a testament to the enduring power of Greek civilization, even in defeat. This cultural exchange wasn't always a smooth process. Some Romans, particularly the older generation, viewed Greek influence with suspicion, seeing it as a sign of decadence and moral decay. They worried that the younger generation was becoming too enamored with Greek ways, neglecting traditional Roman values of discipline, duty, and piety. Cato the Elder, that famously grumpy Roman statesman, was particularly vocal in his criticism of Greek influence, famously declaring, "Graeculus Syrians in caelum usuris ibit." If you tell a hungry Greek to go to heaven, thandruls gerzo, lasestio. He'll go. But despite these reservations, Greek culture continued to permeate Roman society. It was simply too powerful, too sophisticated, too good to resist. Over time, the relationship between Rome and Greece evolved. The initial period of conquest and subjugation gradually gave way to a more complex, nuanced relationship, one characterized by both conflict and cooperation, resentment and respect. Greece became an integral part of the Roman world, providing it with intellectual and artistic capital, while Rome provided Greece with stability and security, albeit at a price. In the long run, Rome formally organized much of Greece as the province of Achaia. This happened later during the reign of Augustus, solidifying Roman administrative control. But even before that formal designation, the path was being paved. Roman governors did begin to appear, overseeing key regions and ensuring that Roman interests were protected. Roman law was gradually introduced, often coexisting with existing Greek legal systems. Roman infrastructure projects such as roads and aqueducts were undertaken, improving communication and trade. So, let's recap. After the destruction of Corinth, Rome didn't simply impose its will on Greece through brute force. It employed a more sophisticated strategy. Divide and rule, exploiting existing divisions among the Greek city-states. Indirect rule, empowering local elites to act as Roman proxies. Economic exploitation, imposing taxes and extracting resources. Symbolic domination, erecting monuments and statues to proclaim Roman power. Cultural co-option, allowing Greek culture to flourish while subtly shaping it to serve Roman interests. It was a masterful, if cynical, strategy, and it worked. Greece became a valuable part of the Roman Empire, a source of wealth, manpower, and perhaps, most importantly, cultural prestige. But the price of that freedom, as Flamininus had so eloquently proclaimed, was the loss of Greek independence and the beginning of a new era, the era of Roman dominance. And in the next chapter, we'll examine how this dominance played out in the centuries to come, exploring the long-term consequences of Rome's conquest of Greece, and the enduring legacy of this unlikely partnership. We'll see how Greek ideas shaped Roman civilization, and how Roman power transformed the Greek world forever. Because, as we all know, history is never truly over. It just keeps echoing. So, Achaia was a province. Corinth was rubble. The legions marched on, their sandals kicking up dust that mingled with the ashes of a once proud civilization. But the story, as you might suspect, doesn't end there. Conquest is a messy affair, a tangled web of violence, assimilation, and unintended consequences. And in the case of Rome and Greece, the consequences were particularly fascinating. We're talking about a cultural exchange that shaped the very foundations of Western civilization. Think of it as a hostile takeover with a really, really good employee benefits package, for the Romans anyway. The question now becomes, what happens when the irresistible force meets the immovable object? In this case, the irresistible force was Roman military might and administrative prowess, and the immovable object was, well, Greek culture. You can't just bulldoze centuries of philosophy, art and literature and expect everything to be hunky-dory. Let's start with the Romans themselves. They were, let's be honest, a practical bunch. Engineering, law, military strategy, that was their bread and butter. But when it came to the finer things in life, they looked to Greece. Just picture a Roman general, fresh off a victory, trading his breastplate for a toga, and settling down to listen to a Greek philosopher expound on the virtues of Stoicism. It probably happened more often than you think. Greek tutors became status symbols in wealthy Roman households. They taught Roman children Greek language, literature, and rhetoric. Suddenly, speaking Greek wasn't just for traders and diplomats. It was a sign of refinement, of being cultured. Roman playwrights adapted Greek tragedies and comedies, giving them a Roman spin but retaining the core themes and structures. Think of it as the ancient world's version of Hollywood remaking a foreign film, sometimes brilliant, sometimes not so much. And then there was the art. Roman sculptors copied Greek masterpieces, sometimes verbatim, sometimes with slight alterations to reflect Roman ideals of beauty and power. Greek architectural styles, the Doric, Ionic and Corinthian orders, became the standard for Roman temples, public buildings and even private villas. If you've ever seen a picture of the Roman Forum, you've seen Greek influence in action. Those columns, those pediments, all Greek, baby. But this wasn't just a one-way street. Roman power brought stability, relatively speaking, and infrastructure to Greece. Roman engineers built roads, aqueducts, and public baths, improving the lives of ordinary Greeks, while, of course, making it easier for the legions to march and the tax collectors to collect. New cities were founded, and old ones were revitalized, often with Roman money and Roman planning. Consider the city of Patras. Under Roman rule, it became a major port and commercial centre. Or take Athens, which, despite its loss of political independence, remained a hub of intellectual and cultural activity, attracting Roman students and tourists eager to soak up the wisdom of the ancients. It's the equivalent of a modern-day history buff making a pilgrimage to Rome, except in sandals and with a lot more olive oil. However, let's not paint too rosy a picture. Roman rule also meant taxation, exploitation, and the suppression of dissent. The Greeks may have admired Roman efficiency, but they also resented Roman arrogance and the constant drain of resources to fuel the Roman war machine. There were rebellions, of course, small-scale uprisings that were quickly and brutally put down. The memory of Corinth's destruction served as a potent reminder of the consequences of challenging Roman authority. And there was a subtle but persistent tension between the conquerors and the conquered. The Romans, despite their admiration for Greek culture, never fully trusted the Greeks. They saw them as clever, sophisticated, but also prone to intrigue and instability. The Greeks in turn viewed the Romans as boorish and uncultured, but also respected their power and organizational skills. It was a complicated relationship, a mix of admiration, resentment, and mutual dependence. Over the centuries, this complex dynamic shaped the cultural landscape of both Greece and Rome. Greek intellectuals flocked to Rome, serving as advisors, teachers, and administrators. They brought with them their knowledge of philosophy, rhetoric, and science, enriching Roman intellectual life and influencing Roman policy. Roman emperors, in turn, often sought to legitimize their rule by associating themselves with Greek traditions and mythology. Think of emperors like Hadrian, who was a self-proclaimed Philhellene, lover of Greek culture, and showered Athens with lavish gifts and public works. He even sported a beard in the Greek style, much to the amusement, and probably some consternation, of his more traditional Roman subjects. The integration of Greece into the Roman Empire also had a profound impact on the development of Roman law. Roman jurists drew heavily on Greek legal principles and philosophical ideas, incorporating them into the Roman legal system. This synthesis of Roman pragmatism and Greek intellectualism produced a legal framework that would influence legal systems around the world for centuries to come. Furthermore, the spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire was deeply intertwined with Greek language and culture. The New Testament was written in Greek, and many of the early church fathers were Greek-speaking intellectuals. The Greek philosophical tradition, particularly Platonism, influenced the development of Christian theology. In a way, Greece, even under Roman rule, continued to shape the spiritual and intellectual landscape of the Mediterranean world. So, what's the takeaway here? Rome conquered Greece, yes, but Greece also, in a sense, conquered Rome. The Roman Empire became a hybrid civilization, a fusion of Roman power and Greek culture. This fusion shaped everything from art and architecture to law and religion, leaving a lasting legacy that continues to influence us today. Think about it. When you study history, philosophy, or literature, you're engaging with ideas and traditions that were forged in the crucible of Roman-Greek interaction. When you admire a classical building, you're seeing the echoes of Greek architectural principles. When you read about democracy, you're tracing its roots back to ancient Athens, even though the Roman Republic offered its own unique spin on the concept. The story of Rome and Greece is a reminder that conquest is never a simple transaction. It's a complex process of cultural exchange, adaptation, and transformation. It's a story of power and influence, of dominance and resistance, of assimilation and preservation. And it's a story that continues to resonate with us today as we grapple with the challenges of globalization, cultural diversity, and the enduring legacy of empires. But before we get too caught up in the grand sweep of history, let's remember the individual Greeks and Romans who lived through this period. They were not just pawns in a game of empires. They were people with their own hopes, dreams, and fears. They were farmers, merchants, soldiers, artists, and intellectuals. They were the ones who built the roads, wrote the books, and fought the battles. Their stories, often lost in the grand narratives of conquest and empire, are just as important as the stories of emperors and generals. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. History is not just about the rise and fall of empires. It's about the lives of ordinary people, the choices they make, and the legacies they leave behind. It's about the enduring power of culture, the resilience of the human spirit, and the complex and often unpredictable ways in which the past shapes the present. So next time you see a Roman ruin or read a Greek myth, Take a moment to remember the people who lived and breathed in that world. Their stories are still with us, waiting to be discovered. And who knows, maybe they can even teach us something about ourselves. So the legions marched, the senators decreed, and the games continued. But what did it feel like to be Greek under the eagle's shadow? We've talked about the grand strategies, the political machinations, and the cultural exchange. But history isn't just about emperors and battles, it's about the everyday lives, the quiet acts of defiance, and the slow grinding wheels of societal change. Let's pull back the curtain and peek into the lives of some ordinary folks living in Achaia, the Roman province carved from the heart of Greece. Forget for a moment the marble statues and the soaring rhetoric. Instead, imagine the dust on a farmer's sandals, the ink staining a scribe's fingers, the fear in a merchant's eyes as he tallies his taxes. One such individual might be Aristos, a farmer tilling a small plot of land outside Corinth. Before the Romans came, life was, well, chaotic. Constant squabbles between city-states, shifting alliances, and the ever-present threat of war made planning for the future a risky gamble. The Achaean League, for all its talk of unity, was often just another layer of bureaucracy and infighting. The Romans initially brought a semblance of order. They built roads, improving trade and communication. They suppressed piracy, making the seas safer. They established a legal system, ostensibly fairer than the arbitrary whims of local strongmen. But this order came at a price Aristos felt every harvest season. Roman taxes were robust, let's be polite. Grain, olive oil, wine. A significant portion of Aristos's produce went straight into the coffers of Rome. And not directly to Rome, mind you. It went through a series of intermediaries. Roman tax collectors, local collaborators, and various other officials, each skimming a little off the top. Aristos suspected that much more was taken than was officially owed. But what could he do? Complain? To whom? The Roman governor, who was likely benefiting from the same system? Quote, 7. Flamininus had proclaimed, "But what kind of freedom is it when you're perpetually indebted, when you're working harder than ever just to stay afloat, when you see your children going hungry despite your back-breaking labour?" Aristos wasn't alone in asking this question. Then there's Alara, a young woman from Athens. Bright, articulate, and eager to learn, she dreamed of becoming a philosopher, following in the footsteps of Plato and Aristotle. Under Roman rule, education flourished in a way. Roman elites, eager to absorb Greek culture, funded schools and academies. But there was a catch. The curriculum was increasingly tailored to Roman needs and values. The emphasis shifted from abstract philosophical inquiry to practical skills like rhetoric and law, skills useful for navigating the Roman bureaucracy, for arguing cases in Roman courts, for becoming, well, Romanized. Alara found herself torn. She loved her Greek heritage, the rich intellectual tradition that had shaped her identity. But she also recognized the opportunities that Roman rule presented. A Roman education could open doors, lead to a comfortable life, and grant her influence. But at what cost? Was she willing to sacrifice her cultural identity for personal gain? This internal conflict played out in countless ways across Greece. Some embraced Roman culture wholeheartedly, becoming Roman citizens, adopting Roman customs, and even serving in the Roman army. Others clung fiercely to their Greek traditions, viewing the Romans as barbarians who had defiled their sacred land. Most, however, found themselves somewhere in between, navigating the complex realities of Roman rule, trying to preserve their identity while adapting to the new order. And let's not forget Demetrius, a merchant from Thessalonica. He saw both the benefits and drawbacks of Roman rule more clearly than most. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had opened up new trade routes and created a vast economic network. Demetrius could now trade his goods, olive oil, wine, textiles, across the entire Mediterranean from Spain to Syria. But the Romans were shrewd businessmen, and they weren't afraid to use their power to their advantage. They imposed tariffs on Greek goods, favouring Roman merchants. They controlled key ports and trade routes, extracting tolls and fees, and they often used their military might to bully smaller traders into accepting unfair deals. Demetrius, like Aristos, found himself caught in a system that seemed designed to benefit the Romans at the expense of the Greeks. He could prosper, yes, but only to a certain extent. He would always be second class, always subject to the whims of Rome. So, how did the Greeks resist? Not always with swords and spears. In fact, open rebellion was relatively rare after the initial Roman conquest. The Greeks had learned the hard way that Rome was too powerful to defeat in a direct confrontation. Instead, they employed more subtle forms of resistance. Cultural resistance was perhaps the most potent weapon. The Greeks continued to practice their traditions, celebrate their festivals, and teach their children their history and language. They subtly mocked Roman customs and values in their plays and poems. They preserved their intellectual heritage, ensuring that future generations would remember who they were. They also used their cultural influence to subtly shape Roman society. As we've discussed, Roman elites flocked to Greece to study philosophy, literature, and art. They hired Greek tutors, read Greek books, and decorated their villas with Greek statues. In doing so, they inadvertently spread Greek culture throughout the Roman Empire. Think of it as a form of cultural judo. The Greeks used the Romans' own weight and momentum against them. They allowed the Romans to conquer their land, but they refused to let them conquer their minds. But there was also a more direct, if less visible, form of resistance. Quiet acts of defiance, small acts of sabotage, and subtle forms of non-compliance. Farmers might quote 12 and underreport their harvests. Merchants might quote 13 to pay their taxes. Scribes might quote 14 Roman laws. These acts individually were insignificant, but collectively they represented a persistent challenge to Roman authority. Consider the story of the aqueduct in Corinth. The Romans, ever the engineers, decided to build a grand aqueduct to supply the city with fresh water. A boon for everyone, right? Except the Greeks, who had always relied on their own wells and springs, saw it as an attempt to control their resources and undermine their traditional way of life. So, they, quote, 15 damaged the aqueduct during construction. They, quote, 16 blocked the water flow. They, quote, 17 used the wrong materials. The Romans, frustrated and bewildered, eventually gave up and abandoned the project. The Greeks had won a small victory, a symbolic act of defiance that demonstrated their refusal to be completely subjugated. The fusion of Roman power and Greek culture was not a smooth, harmonious process. It was a messy, complicated, and often contradictory affair. It involved conquest, exploitation, resistance, and adaptation. It was a story of power and submission, of cultural exchange and cultural appropriation, of loss and gain. and its legacy is still with us today. Our legal systems, our political institutions, our art, our literature, our philosophy, all bear the imprint of both Roman power and Greek culture. We are, in a very real sense, the inheritors of this complex and often troubled relationship. So, the next time you admire a Roman arch or read a Greek poem, remember the ordinary folks who lived through this period. Remember Aristos, Ilara, and Demetrius. Remember their struggles, their sacrifices, and their quiet acts of defiance. Remember that history is not just about the grand narratives of empires and conquests. It's about the lives of the people who lived through them. And it's in those lives that we find the true meaning of the past. The echoes of empire, the weight of legions, and the whisper of muses all interwoven into the fabric of our present. What will we do with this inheritance? That, my friends, is the question we must continue to ask ourselves. So, life under Roman rule wasn't exactly a picnic, was it? We've seen how the average Greek, from the olive groves of Arcadia to the bustling ports of Delos, felt the pinch of Roman governance. But what about those who, by birth or ambition, found themselves closer to the levers of power? How did the Roman yoke feel to the Greek elites, those who might have once dreamed of leading independent city-states or even empires of their own? Well, it's complicated. As we've touched on before, Rome wasn't stupid. They understood that outright oppression, while sometimes necessary, was rarely the most efficient way to control a vast territory. A far better strategy: co-opt the local leadership, offer them a seat at the table, albeit a smaller, less ornate seat, and let them manage their own people as long as they kept the taxes flowing and the peace maintained. Think of it as a franchise agreement. Rome provides the brand, the security, and the overall strategic direction. The local elites get to run the day-to-day operations, keep a portion of the profits, and enjoy a level of prestige and authority they might not have had otherwise. Sounds pretty good, right? Except there's always a catch, isn't there? For many Greek aristocrats, the initial allure of Roman patronage quickly faded as the true nature of the arrangement became clear. They were still Greeks, after all, steeped in a tradition of self-governance and fiercely proud of their heritage. To be reduced to mere administrators, enforcing the will of a foreign power, was a bitter pill to swallow. Take, for example, the case of Philopoemen of Megalopolis. Now, Philopoemen was a genuine hero, the last of the Greeks, as some called him. A brilliant general and statesman, he had dedicated his life to strengthening the Achaean League and preserving Greek independence. He was a man of principle, a man of action, a man who, frankly, made most Roman senators look like pampered dilettantes. After the Achaean League's final, disastrous stand against Rome, Philopoemen was captured and brutally executed. His death sent shockwaves through the Greek world. Not because he was irreplaceable, no one is, but because it underscored the utter ruthlessness of Roman power. Even a man as respected and admired as Philopoemen was ultimately expendable in the eyes of Rome. His story, though tragic, serves as a stark reminder. While some Greek elites willingly embraced Roman rule, seeing it as a path to personal advancement or simply accepting it as an unavoidable reality, others harboured deep resentment. They might have outwardly conformed, attending Roman banquets, learning Latin, and even adopting Roman customs, but in their hearts they yearned for the days of Greek independence. This simmering discontent manifested in various ways. Some channeled their frustrations into intellectual pursuits, writing histories that subtly criticized Roman rule or preserving Greek philosophical traditions that emphasized freedom and self-determination. Others engaged in more direct forms of resistance, supporting bandit groups that harassed Roman officials or plotting conspiracies to overthrow Roman authority. These conspiracies, of course, were rarely successful. Rome had a knack for sniffing out trouble before it could truly blossom. Their intelligence network was extensive, their punishments swift and brutal. But the very fact that these plots continued to emerge decade after decade is a testament to the enduring spirit of Greek resistance. And it wasn't just the old guard, the established aristocrats, who felt this way. A new generation of Greek leaders was also beginning to question the benefits of Roman rule. These were men and women who had grown up under Roman domination, who had never known a truly independent Greece. But they had also heard the stories of their ancestors, of the glory days of Athens and Sparta, of the heroic struggles against the Persians. They had read the works of Homer and Plato, of Thucydides and Aristotle, and they couldn't help but wonder if there was more to life than simply being a well-behaved subject of the Roman Empire. These younger Greeks often found themselves caught between two worlds. On the one hand, they recognized the advantages of Roman rule, the peace, the prosperity, the opportunities for advancement. On the other hand, they felt a deep sense of cultural and national pride, a longing for a return to the values and ideals of their ancestors. Many of them chose to navigate this complex landscape by focusing on preserving Greek culture. They founded schools and libraries, supported artists and writers, and promoted the study of Greek history and literature. They believed that by keeping the flame of Greek culture alive, they could ensure that their people would never be completely absorbed by the Roman Empire. Others took a more active role in politics, seeking to influence Roman policy from within. They ran for local offices, cultivated relationships with Roman officials, and used their positions to advocate for the interests of their fellow Greeks. They understood that Rome was not going away anytime soon, but they also believed that it was possible to mitigate the worst aspects of Roman rule and to create a more just and equitable society. One such individual was Atticus, not the Atticus you might be thinking of, not the famously eloquent friend of Cicero. This Atticus was a wealthy Athenian landowner, a member of one of the city's oldest and most respected families. He was a man of impeccable education and refined tastes, a patron of the arts, and a respected member of the Athenian community. Atticus, unlike some of his peers, wasn't interested in outright rebellion. He sought the futility of the armed resistance against the might of Rome. Instead, he adopted a more subtle long-term strategy. He believed that the key to preserving Greek identity was to maintain its cultural and intellectual vitality. He poured his considerable wealth into supporting Athenian schools and libraries, ensuring that young Greeks had access to the best possible education. He commissioned new works of art and literature, encouraging Greek artists and writers to explore themes of national pride and cultural identity. He even hosted lavish banquets and symposia, inviting Roman officials and Greek intellectuals to mingle and exchange ideas. His approach wasn't without its critics. Some accused him of being a collaborator, of selling out his own people for the sake of personal gain. Others dismissed him as a naive idealist, arguing that Rome would never truly respect Greek culture, but Atticus remained undeterred. He believed that by preserving the best of Greek civilization, he could ensure that its legacy would endure long after the Roman Empire had crumbled to dust. He understood that the conquest of Greece was not just a military victory, but a cultural one as well, and he was determined to fight back, not with swords and spears, but with ideas and art. So, as we move forward, remember that the story of Roman Greece is not simply a tale of conquest and subjugation. It's a story of resilience, of cultural survival, of the enduring power of the human spirit. It's a story of how a conquered people can, in their own way, conquer their conquerors. The Greeks, even under Roman rule, continued to shape the world, to influence its art, its philosophy, its literature, and its very way of thinking. And that, my friends, is a victory worth celebrating. But the seeds of future conflict, future uprisings, were also being sown in this complex environment. Discontent, even when subtle, has a way of finding its outlet, doesn't it? And Rome, for all its power, couldn't see everything. They certainly couldn't see the long game being played by the very people they sought to control. The game of cultural preservation, subtle defiance, and the quiet, simmering hope for a future where Greece might once again be master of its own destiny. The olive groves of Attica shimmered under the Aegean sun, a scene of timeless beauty. Row upon row of ancient trees, their silvery leaves rustling in the gentle breeze, created a dappled mosaic of light and shadow across the rolling hills. Seemingly oblivious to the political climate that hung heavy in the air, the grove stood as a testament to the enduring spirit of Greece, a spirit that Atticus, as we left him in the previous chapter, was so desperately trying to preserve. He was a beacon of hope, investing his considerable wealth in preserving Greek culture and education, building libraries and supporting scholars. But let's be honest, can one man's philanthropy truly stem the tide of Roman dominance, especially when the very foundations of Greek society were being eroded, brick by painstaking brick? Can a single candle truly illuminate a cavernous darkness? The answer, of course, is complicated. As complex as the swirling patterns of the Aegean currents, as nuanced as the philosophical debates that echoed through the halls of the academy. Atticus's efforts, while admirable, were a localized palliative. Think of it as applying a soothing balm to a festering wound. The fragrant oils might ease the immediate pain, the cool touch might offer temporary relief, but it doesn't address the underlying infection. The infection, in this case, was the systemic exploitation and political subjugation that characterized Roman rule. It was a disease that gnawed at the very soul of Greece, slowly poisoning its spirit. And where there is exploitation, there is, inevitably, resistance. It is a fundamental law of human nature, as immutable as the rising and setting of the sun. Now, before you conjure images of massed phalanxes clashing against Roman legions, the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel echoing across the plains of Thessaly, understand that resistance in Achaea wasn't always a matter of open warfare. More often, it was a subtle, insidious thing. A quiet refusal to fully embrace Roman ways, a carefully cultivated adherence to ancient traditions, a whispered joke at the expense of a Roman official, a knowing glance exchanged between friends as they watched a Roman magistrate attempt to navigate the complexities of Greek customs. It was the slow, steady erosion of Roman authority, 1,000 tiny acts of defiance that, in their totality, represented a powerful force. But sometimes the whispers grew louder. Sometimes the simmering resentment boiled over, like the hot springs of Thermopylae, erupting in sudden and unexpected bursts of steam and fury. Our focus shifts now to a figure far removed from the opulent villas of Athens, far from the intellectual circles and the refined debates. We're leaving behind the marble columns and the sun-drenched courtyards, and heading to the rugged mountains of the Peloponnese, to the region of Arcadia, a land famed for its shepherds, its rustic simplicity, and increasingly its simmering discontent. The air here was different, thinner, sharper, carrying the scent of pine and wild thyme. The landscape was a tapestry of greens and browns, a stark contrast to the gleaming white of Athenian architecture. Here, amongst the scattered villages and winding mountain paths, lived a man named Cleon. Cleon wasn't a philosopher like Alara, lost in abstract thought and the pursuit of knowledge. Nor was he a wealthy merchant like Demetrius, navigating the intricate web of trade and commerce. He wasn't even a particularly skilled farmer like Aristos, blessed with a green thumb and an innate understanding of the land. Cleon was, by all accounts, an ordinary man. His hands were calloused from years of hard labour, his face weathered by the sun and wind. But ordinary men, when pushed to the brink, are capable of extraordinary things, just as a seemingly insignificant pebble can trigger an avalanche, so too can an ordinary man ignite a revolution. Cleon had witnessed firsthand the slow strangulation of his community. The relentless taxes imposed by Rome, ostensibly for the maintenance of infrastructure and the Pax Romana, were bleeding the villagers dry. Each coin demanded felt like a piece of their soul being ripped away. Fields lay fallow because farmers couldn't afford to plant them, the seeds rotting in their sacks, a bitter symbol of their despair. Families went hungry, their children's faces gaunt and pale, their laughter replaced by the gnawing emptiness of empty stomachs. The vibrant communal life that had once defined Arcadian society, the festivals and celebrations, the shared meals and the communal spirit, was slowly withering, like a vine deprived of water. What pushed Cleon over the edge wasn't a grand political ideal or a burning desire for glory. It wasn't a thirst for power or a yearning for recognition. It was something far more personal, something far more visceral, the death of his younger brother, Theron. Theron, weakened by malnutrition, his body unable to fight off the simplest ailment, succumbed to a fever that could have easily been treated with proper nourishment, with a little bit of meat in his broth, a little bit of honey to soothe his throat. Cleon watched him die, his eyes wide with a mixture of grief and impotent rage, a rage building within him that no amount of philosophical musing could quell, a rage that burned like a wildfire in his soul. "They're stealing our lives," Cleon muttered to his wife Lyra, his voice hoarse with grief and anger, as he buried his brother on a windswept hillside overlooking the valley. The wind whipped around them, carrying his words away like seeds scattered on barren ground. "They're stealing our very lives, and we just stand here and let them." He clenched his fists, the knuckles white with strain, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Lyra, a pragmatic woman hardened by years of hardship, her face etched with the lines of worry and resilience, looked at him with a mixture of concern and understanding. She knew the depth of his pain, the weight of his despair. "What can we do, Cleon? We're just farmers. We have no soldiers, no weapons, no power." Her voice was soft, laced with a weariness that spoke of countless battles fought and lost. "We have our hands," Cleon replied, clenching his fists tighter. "And we have our anger." His voice was low but firm, resonating with a newfound determination. "That anger is a weapon, Lyra. We just need to learn how to wield it." Cleon began to quietly gather like-minded individuals. Initially, it was just a handful of men from his village. Farmers who had seen their crops seized, shepherds who had lost their flocks, even a disgruntled blacksmith who had been forced to forge weapons for the Roman army. They met in secret under the cloak of darkness, in a hidden grove nestled deep within the mountains, sharing stories of hardship and resentment, their voices hushed with fear and defiance. Cleon, despite his lack of formal education or military training, possessed a natural charisma, a raw authenticity that resonated with the villagers, tapping into their deep-seated frustration, their yearning for justice. He didn't preach revolution, not at first. He understood that such talk would be met with fear and skepticism. He spoke of defending their families, of protecting their land, of reclaiming their dignity. He spoke of simple acts of defiance, sabotaging Roman supply lines by loosening the wheels of their carts, disrupting tax collection by creating diversions, and refusing to cooperate with Roman officials by feigning ignorance or offering misleading information. Quote, 24, he explained, his voice barely a whisper in the darkness. Quote, 25. He used his hands to illustrate his point, his fingers darting and weaving like a swarm of insects. Word of Cleon's activities spread like wildfire through the Arcadian countryside, carried on the wind like the scent of rebellion. Other villages, facing similar hardships, their spirits crushed by Roman oppression, sent representatives to join his clandestine meetings. The movement grew, slowly but steadily, fueled by desperation and a shared sense of injustice, a collective yearning for freedom. Now you might be thinking, this sounds like a recipe for disaster, and you wouldn't be wrong. A ragtag group of farmers and shepherds, armed with little more than farming implements and a burning desire for revenge, stood little chance against the might of the Roman legions, the best trained and best equipped army in the world. But Cleon wasn't aiming for outright victory. He understood the limitations of his forces, the futility of a direct confrontation. His goal was to make Roman rule in Arcadia unsustainable, to create a climate of instability that would force Rome to divert resources and attention away from other, more strategically important regions. He aimed to be a thorn in their side, a constant irritant that would eventually wear them down. Think of it as a persistent thorn in Rome's side, annoying, irritating, and difficult to remove, a constant reminder of their overreach, their arrogance, and their disregard for the lives of the people they ruled. The first act of defiance came in the form of a coordinated attack on a Roman tax convoy. The villagers, armed with clubs, scythes, and whatever other weapons they could find, rusty swords passed down through generations, sharpened farming tools, even rocks gathered from the fields, ambushed the convoy as it passed through a narrow mountain pass, a treacherous route known only to the locals. The Roman soldiers, caught completely off guard, their arrogance blinding them to the possibility of resistance, were quickly overwhelmed. The taxes, intended to fill the coffers of Rome, were redistributed amongst the villagers a symbolic act of defiance that tasted sweeter than any honey. The attack was a small-scale affair, a mere skirmish in the grand scheme of things, but its impact was enormous. It sent a clear message to Rome. Arcadia was not as docile as they had assumed. It also emboldened other villages to take similar actions, to rise up against their oppressors and reclaim their stolen dignity. Roman officials in Achaea, initially dismissive of the Arcadian unrest, dismissing it as the grumbling of uneducated peasants, began to take notice. The reports of ambushes and sabotage started to pile up on their desks, a growing stack of evidence that could no longer be ignored. They dispatched a small contingent of soldiers to investigate, but the soldiers were met with a wall of silence and passive resistance. Villagers refused to provide information, claiming ignorance of any wrongdoing, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. These soldiers, unfamiliar with the terrain and wary of ambushes, were forced to retreat empty-handed, their tails between their legs. The situation in Arcadia was escalating. What began as a localized protest was threatening to snowball into a full-blown rebellion, a wildfire consuming the dry brush of discontent, and Rome, preoccupied with other matters, the ongoing tensions in Spain, the ever-present threat of barbarian incursions along the Danube, was slow to respond, its attention diverted by more pressing concerns. This is where the story takes a darker turn, as it inevitably must. Because Rome, when provoked, was not known for its restraint. Its response to rebellion was swift and brutal, a demonstration of its absolute power. And Cleon, in his righteous anger, had inadvertently awakened a sleeping giant, a beast that would stop at nothing to maintain its dominion. The question now is not whether Rome will crush the Arcadian rebellion, because let's be honest, we know how this story ends, the inevitable triumph of Roman might, but how much blood will be spilled at the process, and what the long-term consequences will be for the already fragile relationship between Rome and Greece. Will other regions of Greece see Arcadia's defiance as a spark of hope, a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds, or a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the futility of rebellion? Will the Roman response be measured and strategic, a calculated display of force, or brutal and indiscriminate, a scorched earth campaign designed to crush all opposition? And how will figures like Atticus, who advocate for a more nuanced approach to Roman rule, a path of collaboration and cultural exchange, react to the unfolding crisis? Will he be able to use his influence to mitigate the damage, to prevent further bloodshed, or will he be swept away by the tide of violence? These are the questions that will shape the future of Greece under Roman rule, and the answers, as you might expect, are far from simple. They are shrouded in uncertainty, obscured by the fog of war and the complexities of human nature. The seeds of discontent have been sown, and the harvest is sure to be a bloody one. The Aegean sun, which once seemed to shimmer with hope, now casts long, ominous shadows across the land. The torches illuminating the ambush site cast long, dancing shadows that mocked the Roman dead. Cleon, chest-heaving, surveyed the scene. It wasn't a victory to celebrate, more a desperate act etched in blood and fear. The Roman tax collectors, their fine clothes now stained crimson, lay still amongst the overturned carts and scattered coins. Each glint of silver seemed to whisper accusations. Quote 27. Cleon rasped, his voice hoarse. Quote, Verse 28. His small band of Arcadian farmers, faces grim and determined, began gathering what weapons they could salvage. Mostly spears, farm tools sharpened into makeshift blades, and the grim satisfaction of striking back. They knew what was coming. They had heard the stories, seen the brutality inflicted on those who dared defy Rome. But they had also felt the gnawing hunger, the crushing weight of taxes that left their families with nothing. Desperation, it turned out, was a powerful motivator. News of the attack, as these things often do, travelled faster than any Roman messenger. Whispers snaked through the villages, reaching even the ears of Atticus in distant Athens. He received the news with a sinking heart. He had spent years, decades even, fostering a sense of understanding, of mutual respect, between the Greeks and their Roman overlords. He had argued for the benefits of Roman infrastructure, the relative peace they provided, the opportunities for trade and prosperity. Now a single act of violence threatened to undo it all. Quote 29. Atticus muttered to himself, pacing his sun-drenched study. He knew the plight of the farmers. He had heard their complaints, seen their struggles. But violence, he believed, was never the answer. It only invited more violence, more suffering. He immediately dispatched a messenger to Quintus, the Roman governor of Achaia, pleading for restraint, for understanding. He argued that this was an isolated incident, the work of a few desperate men, not a widespread rebellion. He emphasized the loyalty of the vast majority of Greeks, their willingness to cooperate with Roman rule. He hoped, desperately, that Quintus would listen. But Quintus wasn't known for his patience or his understanding. He was a soldier, first and foremost, a man who believed in the iron fist. He saw the attack on the tax convoy not as an isolated incident, but as a direct challenge to Roman authority. And challenges to Roman authority were not to be tolerated. They were to be crushed, swiftly and decisively. "These Greeks," he sneered to his advisers, "they mistake our leniency for weakness. They think they can bite the hand that feeds them. We will remind them who is in charge." Within days, the Roman eagle descended upon Arcadia. A legion, its polished armour gleaming in the sun, marched into the region, its arrival heralded by the thunder of hooves and the glint of steel. Villages were surrounded, homes were searched, and anyone suspected of involvement in the attack was rounded up. Cleon and his band had retreated into the mountains, hoping to wage a guerrilla war, striking at Roman patrols and supply lines. But the Romans were too numerous, too well equipped. They systematically hunted down the rebels, using local informants and ruthless tactics. The Arcadian countryside, once a place of rolling hills and fertile fields, was now a landscape of fear and despair. Homes were burned, crops were destroyed, and families were torn apart. The Romans made an example of Arcadia, a brutal warning to any other region that might contemplate defiance. One particularly grim episode unfolded in Cleon's own village. The Romans, unable to find him, seized his family. His wife Elpida and their 2 young children were dragged before the assembled villagers. A Roman centurion, his face a mask of cold indifference, addressed the crowd. Quote 32, he declared, his voice echoing through the village square. Quote 33. Elpida, despite her terror, stood tall. Quote 34. She cried out. Quote 35. The centurion simply nodded. 2 soldiers stepped forward, their swords drawn. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Some wept, others turned away, unable to bear witness to the horror that was about to unfold. Atticus, having received word of the Roman atrocities, arrived in Arcadia, his face etched with anguish. He pleaded with Quintus to show mercy, to stop the bloodshed. He argued that the harsh reprisals were only fueling resentment and would ultimately lead to more unrest. Atticus implored. Quote 37. Quintus listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Atticus finished, he simply shrugged. Quote 38. He said coldly. Quote 39. Atticus, his heart heavy with despair, realized that he had failed. His efforts to bridge the gap between Greeks and Romans had been in vain. The gulf was too wide, the power imbalance too great. He watched, helpless, as the Roman eagle continued its relentless assault on Arcadia. Meanwhile, Cleon, hidden in the mountains, learned of the fate of his family. The news struck him like a physical blow, leaving him reeling with grief and rage. He had known that his actions would have consequences, but he had never imagined that they would extend to those he loved most. He now faced an impossible choice. He could surrender, hoping to spare his people further suffering, but that would mean admitting defeat, betraying the cause he had fought for. Or he could continue the fight, knowing that it would only lead to more bloodshed and destruction. His men looked to him for guidance, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. They were tired, hungry, and outnumbered. They had lost their homes, their families, and their hope, but they were still willing to fight, to follow Cleon to the bitter end. Quote 40. One of them asked, his voice barely a whisper. Cleon looked at them, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. He knew that the odds were stacked against them. He knew that they could not win. But he also knew that they could not surrender. They had to fight. They had to show the Romans that they would not be broken, that they would never give up their fight for freedom. Cleon declared, his voice ringing with renewed resolve. Quote 42. And so the rebellion in Arcadia continued, fueled by grief, rage, and a desperate hope that somehow, someday they would be free. But the Roman eagle was relentless, and the shadow of its wings loomed large over the ravaged land. The price of defiance had been paid in blood, and the future remained shrouded in uncertainty. The question now wasn't whether Rome could crush the rebellion, but what the cost would be, and what scars it would leave on the already fractured relationship between conqueror and conquered. Would this spark a wider flame, or be stamped out as a cautionary tale? Only time and more bloodshed would tell. The smoke still choked the valleys of Arcadia. You could taste it, acrid and bitter, a constant reminder of Quintus's fury. The legion had moved on, leaving behind a landscape scarred not just by fire and sword, but by a deeper, more insidious kind of damage, the kind that festers in the soul. We often talk about Roman efficiency, their military prowess, their ability to build roads and aqueducts, but their efficiency extended to cruelty as well. The decimation of Arcadia was a calculated act, a lesson etched in blood and ash for any other Greek community daring to dream of freedom. Villages were razed, fields salted, a symbolic gesture really, since the land was already poor, and prominent citizens, well, they simply disappeared. What purpose did this violence serve? Did Quintus truly believe he could crush the spirit of an entire people with such brutality? Or was it a more pragmatic calculation? A way to eliminate potential leaders, to terrorize the population into submission, and to ensure a steady flow of taxes into the Roman coffers? Perhaps it was a little of both. Rome, you see, was always good at justifying its actions with a veneer of logic, no matter how monstrous those actions might be. Atticus, as you might imagine, was beside himself. He'd ridden to Arcadia immediately after hearing reports of the legion's rampage, his pleas for restraint echoing uselessly in the wake of the devastation. He wandered through the ruins of once thriving villages, his face etched with a grief that went beyond mere sorrow. It was a grief born of betrayal, of shattered illusions. He had believed, naively perhaps, in the possibility of a harmonious coexistence, a synthesis of Roman order and Greek culture. Now all he saw was the cold, hard reality of Roman dominance. "What have we done?" he muttered, kicking at a charred timber. The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but it hung in the air, a heavy indictment of Roman policy and his own complicity. He found survivors huddled in the hills, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. They spoke in hushed tones of the horrors they had witnessed, the summary executions, the looting, the casual cruelty of the legionaries. They spoke of Cleon too, their voices filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. He had become a legend, a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds. But legends, as we know, are often born of desperation. Cleon was no Achilles, no Leonidas. He was a farmer, a man driven to violence by injustice, and his rebellion, while inspiring, was ultimately doomed. Quintus, of course, saw it differently. To him, Cleon was a bandit, a troublemaker, a threat to Roman authority. He dispatched patrols throughout Arcadia, offering a hefty reward for Cleon's capture, dead or alive. He tightened the screws on the remaining population, imposing even harsher taxes and demanding absolute obedience. The result, predictably, was not submission, but simmering resentment. The people of Arcadia might have been cowed into silence, but their hatred for Rome burned brighter than ever. And that hatred, as history has repeatedly shown, is a dangerous thing. Meanwhile, Cleon and his band of rebels retreated further into the mountains, their numbers dwindling, their supplies running low. They were hunted men, constantly on the move, forced to rely on the support of sympathetic villagers who risked their lives to provide them with food and shelter. You might be wondering, where was Ilara during all of this? Well, after the initial attack on the tax convoy, she had remained in Arcadia, tending to the wounded and helping to organize the resistance. She had witnessed firsthand the brutality of the Roman response, and it had hardened her resolve. The naive philosopher had been replaced by a woman of action, a woman willing to fight for her people. She became Cleon's confidant, his advisor, his conscience. She tempered his rage, urging him to focus on strategic objectives rather than impulsive acts of revenge. She reminded him that their struggle was not just about Arcadia, but about the future of all Greece. One evening, as they sat huddled around a small fire, Ilara looked at Cleon, his face gaunt and lined with fatigue. "We cannot win this war through force alone, Cleon," she said softly. "We need to find a way to unite the other Greek city-states, to show them that Rome is not invincible." Cleon shook his head. "They are too divided, Ilara. They are too afraid. They will not risk the wrath of Rome." "Perhaps," Ilara conceded, "but we must try. We must send messengers to Athens, to Sparta, to Corinth. We must plead our case, show them the truth of Roman oppression." It was a long shot, but Cleon agreed. He knew that their survival depended on more than just their own courage and determination. They needed allies, they needed resources, they needed hope. Atticus, back in Athens, was wrestling with his own demons. The events in Arcadia had shaken him to his core. He could no longer reconcile his belief in Roman order with the reality of Roman brutality. He saw the resentment simmering beneath the surface of Greek society, the growing disillusionment with Roman rule. He knew that something had to be done, but he didn't know what. He couldn't condone Cleon's rebellion, but he couldn't ignore the legitimate grievances of the Greek people either. He was caught between two worlds, torn between his loyalty to Rome and his love for Greece. One day, a ragged messenger arrived at his door bearing a letter from Elara. It was a plea for help, a desperate cry for unity. Elara described the horrors of Arcadia, the suffering of the people, the injustice of Roman rule. She urged Atticus to use his influence, his wealth, his connections to rally support for their cause. Atticus read the letter, his heart aching with sorrow and a growing sense of responsibility. He knew that he couldn't stand idly by while his country was being torn apart. He had to act. But how? He decided to travel to Rome to speak directly to the Senate, to plead for a more just and equitable policy towards Greece. It was a risky move, one that could easily backfire, but Atticus felt he had no choice. He had to try. As he prepared for his journey, he couldn't help but wonder if he was already too late. Had the scars of Arcadia already run too deep? Had the hatred between Romans and Greeks become too entrenched? Was there any hope for reconciliation? Or was Greece doomed to a future of endless conflict and oppression? These were the questions that plagued him as he set sail for Rome, his heart heavy with doubt and a flicker of desperate hope. The fate of Greece, it seemed, hung in the balance, and the actions of a single man, caught between two worlds, might just tip the scales. He knew, with chilling certainty, that his choices now would define not only his own legacy, but the future of his people. The journey ahead would be treacherous, not just in terms of distance, but in the moral compromises and political manoeuvrings that awaited him in the heart of the Roman Empire. Would he be able to maintain his integrity, his commitment to justice, in the face of such overwhelming power? Only time would tell. Atticus, his face etched with a weariness that belied his years, boarded the merchant ship bound for Ostia. The Aegean winds whipped around him, carrying the scent of salt and the distant echoes of a land he might never fully recognize again. He carried with him not gold or jewels, but scrolls filled with carefully reasoned arguments, pleas for understanding, and the names, oh, the countless names, of those who had suffered under Quintus's iron fist. Would the Roman Senate even listen? Doubts gnawed at him, persistent as the sea spray against his face. Yet he pressed on, fueled by the desperate hope that reason and justice still held some sway in the heart of the Republic. The journey was arduous, weeks blurred into a monotonous rhythm of creaking timbers, stale bread, and the endless horizon. Atticus used the time to refine his arguments, pacing the cramped deck, muttering to himself, rehearsing the speech he would deliver before the Senate. He spoke to the sailors, listening to their tales of Roman efficiency and occasional Roman cruelty. He learned that even within the vast Roman machine there were cogs that questioned, that felt a pang of conscience. This gave him a sliver of encouragement. Meanwhile, back in Arcadia, Cleon and Elara faced a starkly different reality. The Roman eagle, having tasted blood, was not easily sated. Quintus, enraged by the audacity of the rebellion, had intensified his scorched earth policy. Villages were razed, crops burned, and suspected sympathizers were subjected to brutal interrogations. "They want to break us, Cleon," Elara said, her voice tight with anger as they huddled in a hidden cave, the flickering torchlight casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. "They want to grind us into dust and scatter us to the winds." Cleon, his eyes hardened by loss and hardship, nodded grimly. "Then we will become the wind, Elara. We will become a storm that they cannot contain." But turning words into action was proving increasingly difficult. Their band of rebels, though fiercely loyal, was dwindling. Supplies were running low, and the Romans had tightened their grip on the region, making it nearly impossible to obtain food or weapons. They needed allies, and they needed them fast. Elara, ever the strategist, proposed a daring plan. "We need to send emissaries to the other city-states," she said, spreading a crude map on the cave floor. "Achaea, Elis, even Athens. We must convince them that Arcadia's struggle is their struggle. If we stand divided, we will all fall." Cleon hesitated. Trusting the other city-states was a gamble. Many were wary of Rome, yes, but they were also wary of each other, caught in a web of ancient rivalries and petty jealousies, but they had no other choice. He dispatched small groups of trusted fighters, each carrying a message of defiance and a plea for unity. The fate of Arcadia, and perhaps all of Greece, rested on their success. In Rome, Atticus finally disembarked, his legs unsteady after weeks at sea. The city was a cacophony of sights and sounds, a teeming metropolis that both impressed and overwhelmed him. Grand temples stood alongside squalid tenements, and the air thrummed with the energy of a people convinced of their own invincibility. He made his way to the house of a distant Roman relative, a minor senator named Lucius Valerius. Lucius, though sympathetic to Atticus's plight, was cautious. "The Senate is not easily swayed by sentiment," he warned, "especially when it comes to matters of empire. You must present your case carefully, Atticus. Emphasize the economic benefits of a stable and prosperous Greece. Appeal to their sense of justice, yes, but also to their self-interest." Atticus spent days preparing, poring over his scrolls, refining his arguments, and practicing his Latin. He knew that he had one chance to make a difference, and he couldn't afford to fail. The day he was granted an audience before the Senate was sweltering. He stood before the assembled senators, a sea of stern faces and patrician noses, and began to speak. He spoke of the rich history of Greece, of its contributions to art, philosophy, and law. He spoke of the suffering of the Arcadian people, of the brutality of Quintus, and of the growing resentment that threatened to engulf the entire region. Quote, 56. He pleaded, his voice echoing through the chamber. Quote, 57. He presented his scrolls, the names of the victims, the accounts of Roman atrocities. He spoke with passion, with eloquence, with the full weight of his conviction. When he finished, a hush fell over the Senate. Some senators shifted uneasily in their seats, while others remained impassive, their faces betraying nothing. The debate that followed was long and heated. Some senators, swayed by Atticus's arguments, argued for a more lenient policy towards Greece. Others, more hawkish, dismissed him as a troublemaker and a threat to Roman authority. Quote 58. One senator thundered. Quote, 59. Lucius Valerius spoke in Atticus's defence, emphasizing the economic benefits of a stable Greece and the dangers of alienating a valuable ally. But his voice was drowned out by the chorus of those who favoured a more aggressive approach. In the end, the Senate voted. The result was a compromise, a watered-down resolution that acknowledged the suffering of the Arcadian people, but stopped short of condemning Quintus or changing Roman policy. Quintus would be, quote, 60 to exercise more restraint, but no concrete action would be taken to hold him accountable for his actions. Atticus left the Senate chamber, his heart heavy with disappointment. He had failed. He had pleaded for justice, but he had been met with indifference. The weight of chains on Greece felt heavier than ever. Back in Arcadia, Cleon received a coded message from Athens. The response to his plea for help was lukewarm. The Athenians, still smarting from past defeats, were unwilling to risk Roman wrath. Other city-states offered similar excuses. Fear, it seemed, was a more powerful motivator than solidarity. Elara, however, refused to despair. Quote, 61, she said. Quote, 62. She had been quietly building a network of support among the rural population, the farmers, shepherds, and artisans who had suffered the most under Roman rule. These were not seasoned warriors, but they were fiercely loyal and deeply committed to the cause of freedom. Cleon, inspired by Elara's unwavering faith, decided to change tactics. Instead of seeking a large-scale confrontation with the Roman legions, he would focus on guerrilla warfare, striking at Roman supply lines, ambushing patrols, and disrupting their operations. It was a risky strategy, but it was their only hope. One moonless night, Cleon and his men attacked a Roman convoy carrying supplies to Quintus's headquarters. The ambush was swift and brutal. The Roman soldiers, caught off guard, were quickly overwhelmed. The supplies were seized and the convoy was set ablaze. The flames lit up the night sky, a beacon of defiance in the darkness. Quintus, watching from his headquarters, his face contorted with rage, vowed to crush the rebellion once and for all. He ordered his legions to hunt down Cleon and his men, to scour the countryside, and to leave no stone unturned until they were brought to justice. Atticus, having witnessed the cold heart of Roman power, prepared to return to Greece. He carried no grand promises, no sweeping reforms, only a profound sense of failure and a renewed determination to find another way, any way, to ease the suffering of his people. He knew that the struggle for Greece was far from over. It had only just begun. The echo of hope, however faint, still resonated within him. He would not let it die. Atticus returned to Achaia a changed man. The marble halls of the Roman Senate, once a symbol of justice and order in his mind, now felt like a gilded cage, filled with men more concerned with power and prestige than the plight of a distant province. He had pleaded, he had reasoned, he had even, dare we say, grovelled. All to no avail. The senators, comfortable in their villas and fueled by the spoils of empire, saw Arcadia as a minor inconvenience, a fly to be swatted without a second thought. What could he do now? The rebellion, though valiant, was clearly doomed. Cleon and Elara were fighting a losing battle, and every day brought more suffering to the already ravaged countryside. Atticus couldn't stand idly by, watching his homeland bleed. He sought out Elara, finding her not in some hidden mountain cave as he expected, but in a small, unassuming farmhouse nestled in the foothills. The woman he found there was a far cry from the idealistic young scholar he remembered. Her eyes were hardened, her face etched with worry, but her spirit, he sensed, remained unbroken. Quote, 63. She greeted him, her voice weary. Quote, 64. He shook his head, the weight of his failure heavy on his shoulders. Quote, 65. Elara sighed, a puff of air that seemed to carry the weight of Arcadia's despair. We knew it. Cleon knew it. But we had to try, for the sake of our people. And what now? Atticus asked, his voice barely a whisper. We fight on, Elara said, her voice regaining its steel. We fight for every inch of land, for every stolen grain, for every life taken unjustly. We will make them pay a price they will not soon forget. Atticus admired her resolve, but he also feared for her safety, for Cleon's, and for the future of Arcadia. He knew that brute force wouldn't win this fight. Rome had too many soldiers, too much wealth, too much ruthlessness. There must be another way, he said, more to himself than to Elara. Violence only breeds more violence. We need to strike at them where they are weakest. Elara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. And where is that, Atticus? Their legions seem impenetrable. Their unity, Atticus said, a spark of hope flickering in his eyes. Rome is a powerful empire, yes, but it is also a collection of factions, of competing interests. We need to exploit those divisions, to sow the seeds of discord within their own ranks. He explained his plan. It was audacious, perhaps even reckless, but it was the only chance he saw to save Arcadia from complete annihilation. He would use his wealth and influence to gather information, to identify those Romans who were sympathetic to the Greek cause, or at least those who were willing to listen to reason. He would then use that information to subtly undermine Roman authority, to create friction between different Roman officials, to make governing Achaea more trouble than it was worth. Elara listened intently, her expression shifting from skepticism to cautious optimism. It's a dangerous game, Atticus. If you are caught— I know the risks, he said, his voice firm, but I cannot stand by and watch my people be crushed. I owe it to them, and I owe it to myself, to do everything in my power to fight for their freedom. And so the seeds of a new kind of resistance were sown. Atticus, the scholar and philanthropist, became a subtle saboteur, a master of intrigue, working from the shadows to undermine the Roman occupation. He started small, spreading rumours and misinformation among the Roman garrison, exaggerating the strength of Cleon's forces and hinting at unrest in other parts of Achaea. He cultivated relationships with disgruntled Roman officials, offering them bribes and favours in exchange for information and cooperation. His efforts were not without their challenges. Quintus, the Roman governor, was a shrewd and ruthless man, and he quickly grew suspicious of Atticus's activities. He ordered his spies to monitor Atticus's movements, to track his conversations, to uncover his secrets. Atticus knew he was walking a tightrope. One wrong step could mean imprisonment, or worse. Meanwhile, Cleon and his rebels continued their fight in the mountains of Arcadia. They ambushed Roman patrols, raided supply convoys, and harassed the Roman garrison at every opportunity. Their numbers were dwindling, and their supplies were running low, but their spirit remained unbroken. They were fighting for their homes, for their families, for their freedom. Elara, ever the pragmatist, focused on maintaining the rebellion's support among the local population. She organized secret meetings, distributing food and supplies to those in need, and spreading propaganda to keep the flame of resistance burning. She knew that without the support of the people, the rebellion would quickly wither and die. The situation in Achaea was becoming increasingly volatile. The Roman authorities were cracking down on dissent, arresting suspected rebels and imposing harsh penalties on those who were caught aiding them. The Greek population was growing increasingly resentful of Roman rule, and the seeds of rebellion were sprouting in every corner of the province. One day, Atticus received a secret message from one of his contacts in Rome. The message contained a piece of information that could potentially change the course of the conflict. A new Roman governor was being appointed to Achaea, a man named Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was known to be ambitious, ruthless, and fiercely loyal to the Roman Senate, but he was also known to be pragmatic, and he had a reputation for being willing to negotiate with his enemies if it served his interests. Atticus saw an opportunity. He knew that Sulla was coming to Achaea to restore order and to quell the rebellion, but he also believed that Sulla could be persuaded to see the futility of a prolonged conflict. He decided to try to make contact with Sulla, to offer him a compromise, a way to end the fighting without sacrificing Roman authority. It was a long shot, but Atticus knew that he had to try. The fate of Achaea, and perhaps the future of Roman-Greek relations, hung in the balance. He reached out to Sulla's envoy, a nervous little man named Marcus, who was eager to curry favour with the new governor. Atticus, using all his considerable charm and a generous purse, convinced Marcus to arrange a secret meeting between him and Sulla. The meeting was held in a secluded villa outside of Corinth, far from the prying eyes of the Roman authorities. Sulla arrived with a small entourage of guards, his face stern and unreadable. Atticus greeted him with a respectful bow, but his eyes were filled with defiance. Atticus said, his voice calm and steady. Sulla fixed Atticus with a cold stare. Quote 80. Quote 81, Atticus said. Quote Kendiitum. He then laid out his proposal. He offered to persuade Cleon and his rebels to lay down their arms in exchange for a general amnesty and a promise of fairer treatment for the Greek population. He also offered to use his influence to promote Roman interests in Achaea, to ensure the smooth collection of taxes and to maintain peace and stability in the province. Sulla listened intently, his expression unchanging. When Atticus finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Atticus's face. "And what do you want in return, Atticus?" Sulla finally asked, his voice low and dangerous. "What is your price for this peace offering?" Atticus took a deep breath. "I want nothing for myself, Governor. I only want what is best for my people and for the future of Achaea." Sulla chuckled, a dry, humourless sound. "You are a fool, Atticus, a naive, idealistic fool. But perhaps you can be useful to me." He paused, then continued, his voice hardening. "I will consider your proposal, but understand this, Atticus. If you betray me, if you attempt to deceive me in any way, I will make you regret the day you were born. Do you understand?" Atticus nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I understand, Governor." The meeting ended without a firm agreement. Sulla left the villa, leaving Atticus to wonder whether he had just made a deal with the devil, or whether he had taken the first step towards saving his homeland. He didn't know the answer, but he knew that the fate of Achaea now rested on his shoulders, and he was determined to do everything in his power to guide it towards a better future. But neither Atticus, nor Ilara, nor even the ruthless Sulla could foresee the storm that was brewing on the horizon, a storm that would once again plunge Greece into chaos and bloodshed and forever alter the course of Roman-Greek relations. The seeds of discord had been sown, and they were about to bear bitter fruit. Sulla, a name that tasted of iron and ambition, listened to Atticus with an almost unnerving stillness. His eyes, the colour of a winter sky just before a storm, remained fixed on Atticus throughout the entire proposition. He neither interrupted nor betrayed any emotion, a mask of Roman composure that could either signify agreement or utter contempt. Quote T9. Sulla finally said, his voice a low rumble. Quote 90. Atticus met his gaze, unflinching. Quote 91. Sulla rose from his chair, a movement that seemed to fill the room with his presence. He walked to the window overlooking Corinth, the rebuilt city a testament to Roman resilience and some might argue Roman hubris. Quote 92. Quote 93. Atticus countered, his voice calm but firm. Quote 94. Sulla turned back, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Quote 95. Quote 96. The meeting stretched on for hours, a dance of words and veiled intentions. Atticus laid out his plan, a carefully constructed web of concessions and incentives, reduced taxes for a period, increased investment in infrastructure, greater autonomy for local councils. He argued that these measures would not only quell the rebellion, but also stimulate the economy and foster a sense of shared purpose. Sulla listened, questioned, probed, and finally, to Atticus's surprise, he offered a conditional agreement. "I will consider your proposals, Atticus, but I will not be swayed by empty rhetoric. I require proof that you can deliver what you promise. Prove to me that you can influence these rebels, that you can bring them to the negotiating table. Bring me Cleon." Bringing Cleon to the negotiating table, that was a task fraught with peril. Cleon, hardened by battle and fueled by righteous anger, would likely view any overture from Atticus as a betrayal. But Atticus knew that this was his chance, a narrow window of opportunity to avert further bloodshed. Atticus left Sulla's presence with a heavy heart and a renewed sense of purpose. His first act was to dispatch a trusted messenger to Elara, carrying a carefully worded letter explaining the situation and requesting a meeting. He knew that Elara, with her sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to her people, would be the key to reaching Cleon. Meanwhile, Atticus began to subtly sow seeds of discord within the Roman ranks. He started small, planting doubts in the minds of key officials, questioning the effectiveness of Sulla's heavy-handed tactics, hinting at the potential for greater profits through cooperation rather than coercion. He used his wealth and influence to spread these ideas, hosting lavish dinners and discreet gatherings where he could subtly influence the opinions of those closest to Sulla. He focused particularly on those Romans who felt sidelined or overlooked by Sulla's inner circle. Men like Marcus Livius Drusus, a tribune with a reputation for ambition and a simmering resentment towards Sulla's perceived favoritism. Atticus, with his keen understanding of human nature, recognized Drusus's vulnerability and exploited it masterfully. He praised Drusus's intelligence, lamented his lack of recognition, and subtly suggested that a more moderate approach to governing Achaea might be beneficial to his career. A successful pacification of Achaea, achieved through diplomacy rather than brute force, Atticus mused during one such dinner, would surely be a feather in any man's cap, Tribune, a testament to his wisdom and foresight. Drusus predictably took the bait. He began to subtly criticize Sulla's policies in the Senate, echoing Atticus's arguments about the need for a more nuanced approach. He also started to gather support among other disgruntled senators, creating a faction that, while not openly opposed to Sulla, was certainly willing to question his authority. Of course, this was a dangerous game. Sulla was not a man to be trifled with, and Atticus knew that his actions could have dire consequences if discovered. But he believed that the potential rewards, a chance to save Achaea from further devastation, outweighed the risks. In the rugged mountains of Arcadia, Cleon and Alara faced their own challenges. The Roman reprisal had decimated their ranks, and supplies were dwindling. The farmers, weary of war and fearful of Roman retribution, were becoming increasingly reluctant to offer support. "We need to show them that we can still fight," Cleon said, his voice grim. "We need to strike a blow against the Romans that will reignite their hope." Alara, however, cautioned against rash action. "A single victory will not win us the war, Cleon. We need to focus on long-term survival. We need to secure new sources of supplies, strengthen our defences, and above all, maintain the support of the people." Their discussions were interrupted by the arrival of Atticus's messenger, breathless and weary from his journey. Alara read the letter carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. Quote 103, quote, she said, handing the letter to Cleon. Quote, Snahen. Cleon scoffed. Quote, Znanon fiber. Quote, Stand Alara countered. Quote, Zan 7. Quote, Zan 8. Cleon demanded. Quote, 109. Alara sighed. Quote, 110. Quote, 111. Cleon spat. Quote, 112. The debate raged for hours, fueled by desperation and distrust. Finally, Alara proposed a compromise. Quote, 113. Cleon reluctantly agreed. He knew that Alara was right. They could not afford to be inflexible. They had to explore every possible avenue, even if it meant dealing with the hated Romans. The meeting between Atticus, Alara, and Cleon took place in a secluded mountain pass, far from the prying eyes of Roman soldiers. Atticus, looking weary but determined, presented his case. He explained the concessions he had secured from Sulla, the steps he was taking to undermine Roman authority from within, and the potential for a lasting peace. Cleon listened in silence, his face etched with suspicion. He grilled Atticus relentlessly, demanding guarantees and assurances that he could not possibly provide. Alara, however, saw a glimmer of hope in Atticus's words. She sensed his sincerity, his genuine desire to help Achaea. "We will consider your proposals, Atticus," she said finally, cutting off Cleon's barrage of questions. Quote, 15. Atticus nodded, relief flooding his face. Quote, 116. As Atticus departed, Cleon turned to Alara, his eyes filled with doubt. Quote, Alara looked out at the rugged landscape, the land that had been soaked with the blood of her people. Quote, 118, she said softly. Quote, 119. The decision they made in the coming days would determine the fate of Achaea. Would they embrace Atticus's offer of negotiation, risking betrayal and compromise? Or would they continue to fight, clinging to their freedom at the cost of further bloodshed? The seeds of discord had been sown, not only within the Roman ranks, but also within the heart of the rebellion itself. The harvest would be bloody, no matter which path they chose.